Buenos días a todos los que formamos parte de la comunidad educativa del Instituto Marcelino Champagnat. Estamos transitando nuestro ciclo de webinars. Este webinar tiene una característica muy particular, ya que va orientada fundamentalmente a aquellos estudiantes de nuestro instituto que ya cursan materias en inglés desde hace un tiempo, por lo que ya se encuentran en un nivel de inglés que los pone en situación de poder escuchar e intercambiar, ¿eh? Y hoy tenemos como expositor de nuestros webinars una personalidad muy especial, que se llama Drufus Myers, que sus amigos lo llaman Drew, ¿verdad? Drew nació en Texas, en Dallas, en los Estados Unidos. Tiene 2 hijas y 3 nietos. Y les cuento un poquito de su vida, porque tiene una trayectoria muy interesante. En el año 1968 se recibió como licenciado en Ciencias y Matemática en la Universidad de Texas. Un año después de eso, cuando estaba cursando su especialización en la Universidad de Watt, tuvo que servir al ejército de los Estados Unidos. Y en ese momento fue donde lo capacitaron en temas sobre guerras radiológicas, biológicas y químicas. Sirvió a su país en Vietnam en el año 1970 por un año completo. Y al volver, pudo volver a sus estudios universitarios y graduarse como doctor en química orgánica con una segunda especialización en química médica en 1974. Respecto de la guerra de Vietnam, Drew quisiera comentarnos que para él fue una experiencia educativa muy importante para su vida personal. En 1980 obtuvo el máster en Ciencias de la Universidad de Bristol, en Inglaterra, en el área de Ciencia Coloide y de la Superficie. Trabajó para los laboratorios de investigación de la empresa Kodak en Nueva York. Se especializó en la síntesis y aplicación del sistema de polímeros para aplicaciones en la fotografía, serografía, análisis clínico, entre otros. Pudo realizar un máster en Inglaterra patrocinado por la empresa Kodak, trabajando en procesos técnicos y problemas relacionados a las interacciones interfaciales. En el año 1983 comenzó a trabajar como consultor técnico independiente y poder así alejarse de los duros y crueles inviernos de Nueva York, habiendo tenido varias experiencias muy duras durante los inviernos. Conoció una bella mujer en Río Tercero, con quien se casó y se embarcó hacia esta nueva democracia que la Argentina le ofrecía, junto a su familia conformada por 2 pequeñas niñas de 1 año y de 3 años de edad en ese momento. Drew nos comenta que para su familia era una aventura a lo desconocido, pero decidieron igual mudarse a la ciudad de Río Tercero, donde sigue viviendo actualmente. Está retirado parcialmente, aunque dedicado a su especialización en las ciencias. Durante los primeros años de esta aventura en Argentina comenzó a escribir un libro, tratando de explicarle a sus amigos y familiares en Estados Unidos por qué había decidido mudarse hasta el fin del mundo. El libro consta de 480 páginas, nunca fue publicado, está en inglés y está disponible para cualquiera que esté interesado en leerlo. Es como una autobiografía. Ha escrito varios libros sobre el fenómeno interfacial y de la superficie. El primer libro ya lleva 4 ediciones, el segundo lleva una segunda edición y ha sido traducido al idioma chino. Es coautor de varias patentes americanas y europeas sobre los sistemas de polímeros y sus aplicaciones y otros temas no relacionados con la química. Ha participado de varios semanarios sobre su especialidad en la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba y en la Universidad Nacional de Río Cuarto. En el año 1999 fue intérprete y traductor durante la revisión de evidencias e informes sobre las explosiones de fábrica militar Río Tercero en 1995. Tuvo un trabajo como de forense. Después de la experiencia como traductor en la investigación Klein de las explosiones de 1995, escribió un análisis profesional de los eventos basados en su propia experiencia sobre explosivos con eventos similares. El libro está en español, pero no se ha publicado. El Instituto Marcelino Champagnat hoy tiene el honor, realmente el honor, de tener esta visita virtual tan especial, que nos va a compartir un poco de cómo ha sido el desarrollo de la historia de los partidos políticos en Estados Unidos y algunas relaciones que podemos encontrar con respecto a nuestro sistema democrático argentino. Así que, Drew, la más cordial y cálida de las bienvenidas a nuestro instituto. Y bueno, lo dejamos con la palabra para que pueda compartir con nosotros.
Bueno, thank you very much, Jose. I thank you, and I'm sure Tessa was the instigator of this whole thing for inviting me to give this this little conference. Tessa will, if the whole thing bombs, Tessa can share the blame for both ends of the disaster if it comes out that way. When I sent you the information about me, I didn't realize that you would use everything in there, which is all right, but it sounded a little bit pompous to me listening to myself being described. But thank you anyway. To begin with, I've had a long informal relationship with the Welcome English Center with Tessa and Cecilia. And I have to say that it has been a very enjoyable and in some ways fruitful relationship. And I think they have a very good operation going on there. Now, while I'm not a language teacher per se, obviously, I have had the pleasure of giving a few classes in advanced conversation at the center, and have made some very good friends there. Some friends who were students, adults for the most part, and they're still very good friends of mine. I've already commented off camera that it's been a long time since I talked much about anything, and so my throat is not really in shape for talking. So I may have to take drinks of water occasionally to sort of keep things lubricated. So when Tessa first called to ask me if I would be willing to take part in this program, my immediate response, sort of a gut response, was sure, why not? It would be interesting and something different to do during these difficult times of somewhat boring doing nothing. However, I was a little unsure about the suggested topics, since history and politics are not exactly on the top of my list of subjects of expertise. I have lots of opinions, but opinions are still opinions. Politics in the United States right now is an extremely hot and literally dangerous topic today. As you may know, if you follow much of the news, and depending on the source of your news, a lot of things are going on, and most of them are not pretty. In the interest of transparency, I will state at the beginning that I have very strong opinions and biases on the subject that I'm going to be talking about as a result of the events of the election taking place next Tuesday and the political campaigns leading up to it. I am trying, or I will try, to avoid injecting excessively my own personal opinions and biases during the presentation. Although after reading a few preliminary questions, it's going to be a hard job trying to stay away from my own opinions. After accepting the invitation and being contacted to set things up with Mr. Flores, he sent me a link to the previous presentation, or one of the previous presentations by Mr. Diego Guelar or Guelar. I'm not sure which way you pronounce it, depending on whether he's Spanish or Italian, I guess. And on listening to the introduction of his past, I realized that I was getting into very deep water well over my head in many ways, in terms of what I had done in life compared to his achievements and his knowledge of the subject he was talking about. And quite frankly, my nerves began to get a little rattled. Here I was, a rather aging, semi-retired chemist from Texas with no formal training in history or politics, living quietly in Rio Tercero, was about to try to uphold the standards of an internationally experienced diplomat while talking about a complex subject that I am purely an amateur at. Add to that the pressure of doing it just 5 days before what is almost certainly the most critical and dangerous election in the last 150 years of US history, and possibly in the entire history of the country. My first two thoughts were, what have I gotten myself into? And where can I hide? When I finally accepted my fate and began to put together my thoughts on the proposed topic, I soon realized that I had perhaps bitten off more than I could chew, as we say in Texas. As Mr. Jimenez said in his introduction, I'm a chemist by training and by trade. I have a good deal of experience giving papers and seminars on chemical topics, although it has been quite a while since I've done so. However, US history and politics, which is what I was asked to discuss today, are not topics that I routinely talk about outside a small circle of friends at the office or some family members sobre mesa, as you would say. Although on Facebook, I quite often get the opportunity to really expound my opinions. In those situations, I'm usually comfortable with the basic knowledge that I have floating around in my head on politics and that sort of thing. Although I actually prefer listening rather than speaking, because I think I learn more by listening and people learn less when I'm speaking, perhaps. But when inspired to do so, I have been known to put in my 10 cents worth, as we say back home. In this situation where I'm supposed to teach something on the subject, which I assume that's the point, me trying to teach you something, my basic insecurities at the time turned the preparation process from a pleasurable chat to something of a pressure-filled challenge. By the way, before I continue, if I'm speaking too quickly, start waving your hand or something, and I will try to slow down. I try to speak slowly, but sometimes it gets away from me. Okay, not only did I commit myself to passing along what I hope is reasonably accurate information on topics that are not in my wheelhouse, as people often say these days, that is, topics on which I have little or no formal training or knowledge, I will be discussing topics on which, in fact, I have very strong, biased personal opinions. I didn't want to end up giving some kind of heated partisan speech where I was taking one side and constantly beating up the other side. But it can be hard for anyone who's talking on a subject to be completely unbiased. In the current COVID-19 crisis, has produced a great deal of hot, angry debates among scientists about such topics as wearing masks, shutdowns, quarantines, vaccines, the proper medical treatments, and the like. Nevertheless, I had made the comment and I intended to press forward to do the best that I could. Sorry, made the commitment, not the comment. So here we are. You, a group of young high school students wanting to learn something about political parties in the United States, with the added burden of trying to do that in English, and me, an amateur history buff, trying to help you do that in English without completely embarrassing myself and boring you to death. All I can promise is that I will try my best to be coherent in what I say and to speak in a way that you can understand most, if not all, of what I'm saying. As I've gone over the material I tried to put together, I've realized that there are a lot of, I wanted to put in a lot of things that really had nothing to do with political parties, because I have done quite a bit of research on the history of Argentina. And so I have had to edit a lot. I also noted that I had, in my discussion, I have included names and dates and events from history, from US history, that may have little meaning to you. All I can say is mea culpa, because I couldn't put it together without putting that information in there, in my own head. It just gives you something to go look up on Google in the future if you really want to know what I was talking about. But apologies aside, we're now in this boat together, and so I will push off from the dock and hope that we can weather the storm and arrive at a safe haven together with our bodies and minds more or less intact. To begin with, I think it would be useful to take a minute or two to explain why I thought I might be able to give you what you wanted based on my interest in politics and history, derived from my life experiences. By the way, again, in the interest of transparency, I will admit that I have a cheat sheet handy to hopefully keep me on track throughout the talk. So if you see my eyes jumping to the side, I'm cheating. So as a high school student in about your age in Texas in the 1960s, we were required to study and pass exams for graduation from high school on subjects like world history, usually in the Mediterranean area, starting in the Mediterranean area with Greek and Roman history, and then tying into the evolution of Western European history, mostly centered on Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, based on Greek and Roman history. Of course, US history, culture, and politics are very heavily influenced by those countries, so our education tended to emphasize those histories and ignore everything else that went on in the world. After world history came United States history, from the original colonization from the United Kingdom, France, and Spain, through the Revolutionary War, the establishment of the country, first under the Articles of Confederation of 1781, and then the current Constitution of 1788. And through all the twists and turns of a growing and ever-evolving nation. Finally, we Texans were required to study the history of Texas. I always like to point out with pride, because Texans are very proud people, that among the 50 states in the United States, Texas is the only one which we consider to be historically and culturally important, with the honor of having been an independent nation before it became a state of the Union. That was the Republic of Texas, which existed from 1836 to 1846. I put that in as sort of a commercial. As a final punishment in high school, which is pretty much the way we saw it as students, we were required to study and pass tests on the United States and Texas constitutions. In other words, we were essentially force-fed history and civics. The education system of the time, theoretically at least, was designed to produce not only literate individuals, but also knowledgeable citizens. Unfortunately, that is not so much the case anymore. In fact, many, if not most, schools in the United States teach little or no history. And they are the ones who have taken over making the rules about and it turns out that liberal and progressive Democrats don't believe in history. They make the history say what they want it to say. But here I'm slipping into personal politics, so I had better get moving along. For most teenage kids that I ever met, studying history, literature, especially Shakespeare, and other such subjects was, or definitely seemed to be, an enormous waste of time. We had better things to do in our young lives than remember the year of the Norman invasion of the British Isles, the names of the principal authors of the Declaration of the Independence, who were the leaders of the first Anglo-Saxon settlers invited to colonize the area of what is now Texas by the Mexican government, and other such useless, entry quotation marks, details of the past long, long ago and far, far away. Well, sometimes things that we think are of as a waste of time in high school turn out to be much more important than we thought when we grow up. I still like to throw out a short quote or phrase I remember from Hamlet or Macbeth, especially in the context of a particularly intense political comment from time to time. But for the most part, classical literature never caught my fancy. I'm a science fiction man to the death. I did learn, however, that the bard, William Shakespeare, really did have some meaningful things to say in his plays. If only he had said them in real English. Eventually, history did begin to make sense to me, however. My experiences in Vietnam and after returning back to the US opened my eyes to a whole new universe of existence beyond the world of chemistry and technology. All of a sudden, I found it important to try to understand some of the whys behind what was happening in the world around us. I began to read more about the US Civil War, World War II, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Civil Rights Movement, and other such times of change and in the world. All of that reading did not, of course, make me an expert on anything, but it gave me but enough information sank into my brain that I began to better understand why the world is such a mess these days. My basic conclusion is that human beings, known scientifically as Homo sapiens sapiens, which literally means wise men, are not by nature particularly wise animals. There's a saying about history that's been around for a long time and expressed in several different variations, but with the same intended point. Those who ignore history are destined to repeat it. However, there's another more recent phrase about history that can significantly modify the first. And that is, history is written by the winners. That means, of course, that history is not an absolute. It may be made up of events and facts that seem to be fixed and verifiable in time and space, but when compiled and interpreted by historians or other people who think they know, such as myself, the meanings and importance of those events can become a matter of opinion, and generally the opinion of record is that of those who won the war, won the election, who won the means of controlling what can be said and printed. In other words, history can become, and increasingly seems to be used as, a tool for creating new history to suit the needs of those in power at the moment. Excuse me a moment. But enough of my preaching. The original suggested topic, our title I was given for this presentation was Democrats and Republicans. Well, that's a little bit of a broad subject to me, so I tried to come up with a title that would help me define something related in that area, but with a little more definition directed, a definite direction when I tried to put together my thoughts. As you may be aware, next Tuesday is a presidential election in the US. It turned out to be one of the most hotly fought, and I mean literally, physically fought in many instances, elections in our history. It could, in fact, become a day of reckoning for the United States, as it has been known for all of its existence, no matter which party wins. It is an extremely dangerous time for my country, and the reason for that danger arises from the current characteristics of the two political parties involved, especially the Democrats. That's an opinion, of course. Given the current hysterics and chaos in US politics and my own strong personal beliefs, I thought a broader title like The Development of Political Parties in Argentina and the United States might be more manageable for me. My idea originally was to try to present a general historical discussion of the political party system in the U.S. with emphasis on the Democratic and Republican parties, the two parties battling to the death to win next Tuesday, and compare it to the evolution of political parties in Argentina over the similar periods in their history. And I wanted to do that with as little personal bias as possible. After a few hours of trying to begin that feat, my head shut down and I decided I would make a strategic retreat. I realized that it would be very presumptuous of me to pretend that I could or should try to teach you anything about political parties in Argentina. And that even if I was crazy enough to try, it would take a commitment of time and brain power well beyond what I can take. Therefore, I essentially eliminated almost everything about Argentina and decided to stick to what I know, or at least think I know, about the evolution of political parties in the US, leading a path to the Democratic and Republican parties of today. First, I'd like to quote a famous US journalist of the 20th century by the name of H.L. Mencken. He said, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, therefore clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. The fears may be irrational, but politics is fueled by emotions, not logic. It is an art, not a science. The amplification of risk is therefore a cunning tool to be used and abused." Now, to paraphrase that, because that may not be terribly easy for you to understand, and I will do my own paraphrasing. What Mencken was saying is that political parties exist to make people worry and demand to be protected by making up threats, most of which are not real. The fear produced may not be real, but politics is fueled by emotion, not logic. It is an art, not a science. Increasing the sensation of risk to the people on the part of the political parties, therefore, is a great way to use and abuse the political process. This has always been the case everywhere that I've ever read about. Now, to begin with, the United States Constitution makes no mention or provision for political parties beyond what is given in the First Amendment rights of free speech, freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress or grievances. That is the rights to say what you want, within reason, of course, print what you want, also within reason, hold meetings and hold peaceful protests, and demand the government to correct or fix problems that exist or imagined to exist. Those rights are pretty much all we need to allow for the creation of political parties. In fact, the founding fathers, which is the term we in the US use to refer to those who founded the country and wrote the Constitution, as our próceres, as you say in this country. They did not originally intend for American politics to be partisan. That is, they did not even consider the possibility of having political parties. However, two of the principal actors involved in the writing process of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, wrote specifically about the possible dangers of creating domestic political factions, that is, partisan party politics, in many publications that were intended to explain, or at least try to explain, why the Constitution was written the way it was. Those writings are called the Federalist Papers. There are 85 essays, originally published anonymously under the name of Publius. I don't know why they would choose that name, in order to try to convince people in the states to ratify the new Constitution. They are so profound and so informative that they are still referred to today in discussions of constitutional questions, in order to understand the thinking of the original authors of the Constitution. What were they thinking about? What did they want to do when they wrote it the way they wrote it? George Washington, of course, the first president of the United States, was not a member of any political party at the time of his election or in office. In fact, in his final address to the Congress, he specifically stated his hope that political parties would not become part of the functioning of the new United States government. He feared that the results of such partisanship would lead to political, economic, and social conflict and stagnation. And in many ways, it turns out that he was right. Nevertheless, the United States two-party system, which is the way we refer to it, was actually started by Washington's closest advisors, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They both had written strong arguments against political factions in their discussions about the writing of the Constitution, yet they ended up being the core leaders in the establishment of the political party system. The system, the first system, was based on the formation of two groups, one called the Federalists, which was led by Alexander Hamilton as the principal leader, and another called the Democratic Republicans, which is an interesting choice of names, given what happened in the future, led by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Those two groups gave birth to the political environment in which partisanship or party politics, once rejected by everyone, came into being. Over the years, there have been and still are so-called third parties, which I will discuss a little later. Except what is referred to as spoiler rolls, where they sometimes gather enough votes from one of the main parties to allow the other party to actually win the election. You may ask why just a two-party system arose in the United States, and why has it remained that way for almost the entire political history of the country. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I have my opinion, and it's purely guesswork. That it had to do with the fact that the basic reason for the rise of partisanship or party politics was in the details of state and federal government operation, and not any kind of broader subject. In essence, to me at least, it came down to where the balance between excuse me, the enumerated powers of the federal government and those reserved to the states should be placed. Now, so that you can sort of understand what that means, the enumerated powers are those that are given to the federal government that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution, such as minting money, the imposition of taxes and tariffs on imported goods, waging war, and things like that. According to the Constitution, all other powers not specifically enumerated to the federal government were reserved to the states. Education, healthcare, many other things of that kind were supposed to be in the province of the states and not the federal government. That clear-cut statement has been significantly diluted in the last 247 years as the federal government has taken over more and more control over the lives of the people. I think the basic philosophy behind that argument stems from the belief that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is the way we put it, works best when that government is closest to the people. For instance, if some function of government is very local, then it should be run by a municipality, not the federal government 2,000 miles away. For that reason, multiple layers of government going down from the federal to the states, counties, and municipalities seemed best. The problems that were determined to be, was who determined what powers were to be given to which level of government, and that is where the political party divisions began to occur. If you think the history of Argentina, think of the history of Argentina during the comparable period of her political formation, some of the very same basic conflicts of ideas, centralized versus local power, have been what produced so much chaos and in the development of the country, and in fact, in my opinion, continues to be a problem to some extent today. But I won't. I say that after I had cut out everything else I had to say about Argentina before there. So back to the question: why a two-party system is standard in the United States? History seems to tell us that mankind is destined to disagree on how many things are done with regard to running the business of government. Monarchies in the 18th century, such as the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and all the rest, had what we might call special interest groups, groups who had different opinions as to how the monarch should do his job. And they tried to influence the crown in terms of policies. Sometimes one group would be successful in that influence, and sometimes, if they were not, they would end up beheaded for their efforts. Modern monolithic dictatorships, such as the ex-Soviet Union, Communist China, North Korea, and the like, are known to have factions with differing opinions on policies, but those factions that are not in agreement with the central party leadership tend to be eliminated or shipped off to gulags and re-education camps. In parliamentary governments around the world, there are usually many political parties or factions, often leading to the need to reform a government based on coalitions. The problem is that if just one partner of a coalition decides that it's unhappy with the situation, they can withdraw and possibly bring down the government and require the formation of new coalitions or require immediate new elections. That's not a very efficient way to run a business or a country, in my opinion, and perhaps Italy is an excellent example of that in recent years. But who really cares about my opinion? In the US, the de facto two-party system arose and has continued throughout its constitutional history. That was fortunate, I think, because working out a conflict between two parties is usually much easier than getting three or more different parties to agree. The early development of the United States was guided and sealed by compromise between the two political parties, and in some cases, two regions of the country, basically the North and the South. Without political compromise, physical conflict often becomes the only alternative seen by one or both sides for solving a problem. For most of the history of the United States, US political parties managed political conflicts pretty well, and the nation prospered. There were bumps in the road and detours along the way, but most problems were overcome by compromise. That was the case until the final solution of the slavery question exploded in 1860, and there was no compromise possible. The result, of course, was the Civil War, in which over 600,000 soldiers died. Without the inclination to seek compromise on difficult questions in political partisanship, stalemate and disaster may lie just around the corner. In the following historical comments, I will try to outline some of the details of the development of the US political system over the years until we arrive at the Democrat-Republican brawl we have today. For most of the time covered, with the exception of the Civil War period, two dominant parties of each era managed to fight it out at the ballot box with little or no actual bloodshed. However, beginning in the 21st century, the political distance between the parties has increased, and their disposition to sit down and talk in search of compromise has greatly diminished. In the current situation, the inclination to compromise, and again, my opinion, especially on the parts of the Democrats, seems to have disappeared, and as a result, blood is literally flowing in the streets. So how did we get from this point to this point from the beginning? The first U.S. two-party system was composed of two groups. The Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, the name of which is, as I said, rather ironic given how things have turned out 247 years later. The Federalist Party grew up out of the national network of friends and associates of George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. That group was in favor of a strong, united central government. They were in favor of close ties to Britain, a centralized banking system, and close links between the government and men of wealth who could presumably organize useful connections in Britain for commercial operations. That is economics. You might call them, and many people did call them, the elitist party. The Democratic Republican Party was founded by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who strongly opposed Hamilton's ideas. Jefferson's party first came to power in 1800, and the Federalists, who were considered the elitist party, as I said, simply could not compete. At the time, the vast majority of white male voters, which were the only kind of voters there were mostly farmers, craftsmen, local tradesmen, and the like, who resented many of the policies of the Federalists. The Federalist program was not a program for the common man, is the way they said it. The Federalist Party managed to survive for a time in the Northeast, mainly because that's where the big cities of the time were located, and the richest men lived in or near the big cities. However, the Federalists refused to support the government during the War of 1812 between the US and Great Britain, almost to the point of some of those states thinking of secession, similar to what happened in the Civil War. When that war ended with a favorable result for the US, the treasonous, as they called it, Federalist Party was essentially destroyed. Between the years of 1816 and 1824, when James Monroe was president, it came to be called the era of good feelings due to a brief period of very little partisanship, and so that the government could go about its business fairly well. There was no room for the elitism of the Federalist Party. The second two-party system existed from about 1828 to 1854. That followed a split in basically the only party, the Democratic Republican Party, for various reasons. During that time, the two major parties that dominated the political scenes were the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, the Democrats having lost the Republican part of their name. The Whig Party emerged from a national Republican Party, which had been the part that split off, leaving the Democratic Party in its place. The Democratic Party was led by the famous General Andrew Jackson, hero of the War of 1812. The Democrats believed in the importance of the presidency over other branches of government, specifically legislative and judicial. That is, strong executive branch, and opposed the idea of questions such as the existence or not of a central national bank, and programs that they felt would benefit industry at the expense of the taxpayer or the common man. The Whigs, on the other hand, wanted the Congress to be more dominant than the executive branch under the president. They also supported policies of modernization and economic protectionism that favored industry, but those policies tended to make life more expensive for the general population, which is the case today. You may notice that such arguments seem to recur over and over in the US and also in Argentinian politics. What's good for industry or what's good for the common man? The Whig Party began to collapse in the 1850s, partly as a result of the decline in the quality of its leadership, but more importantly due to a major internal split over the question of slavery. In addition, old economic issues that had unified the party before began to disappear, and many of its members and leaders drifted over to the opposition Democratic Party. The third system lasted from 1854 into the mid-1890s. It was characterized by the emergence of a very strong anti-slavery Republican Party. Please note that this was the same Republican Party that exists today. The Republican Party that banned slavery is the same party with minor changes that abolished slavery. The Republican Party favored many of the economic policies of the Whigs, which no longer existed, such as the establishment of national banks and the construction of an extensive national railroad network, in which the federal government gave large land grants to railroad companies for their rights of way. That is, they gave them vast amounts of land on which to build their railroads for free. They also favored high customs tariffs on imported goods, the offering of free homesteads on federal lands, and the establishment and government support of land-grant colleges. In case you've never heard of the term land-grant colleges, by the way, they are and still are a rather ingenious tool for making available higher level education to students too poor or too far away from the then established universities, such as Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. They are post-high school colleges and universities that were organized by the states and given large parcels of federal government land as financial endowments to help them cover their operational expenses. At that time in the U.S. history, one thing the federal government was rich in was land. In fact, almost all of the land in the United States was government owned, so it was there to give away. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, was pro-slavery and heavily favored the idea of states' rights, which means that the states retained the power over all government functions that were other than the ones that were enumerated rights in constitutions that in the Constitution that I mentioned earlier. In the northern states where the Republicans held power, the economy was based on manufacturing, crafts, small farms, and such, and slavery really wasn't an important economic issue. Rather, it was a social, moral, and philosophical problem. In the southern states, where cotton was king, as the saying went, slave labor was absolutely vital to the economic stability and viability of the region, and any talk about abolishing it was considered treasonous. There were other states' rights questions involved, but slavery was number one, number two, and number three. After the Civil War, the Democrats remained mostly as the opposition party, except in the South, where it held sway until the mid-20th century. Because of its overwhelming dominance in the South, and with the help of some non-aligned groups in the North and Midwest, the Democrats sometimes managed to gain control of one or both houses of Congress, but the presidency, the White House, eluded them for many, many years. The fourth party system that covered the period 1896 to 1932 consisted of pretty much the same interest groups as the third, but saw major shifts in the central issues of debate. This period also corresponded to what they called the Progressive Era, and it was also dominated by the Republican Party. It's interesting to note that the term progressive was tied to the Republican Party at that time. Today, it's the Democrats who have, in their minds at least. By the way, progressive is a term that pops up a lot in US politics these days, but sometimes it isn't clear exactly what it means and how it differs from just the term liberal. As well as I've been able to understand it, a progressive is a liberal who wants the federal government to pay for all social improvements directly out of its own pocket, as the saying goes. A liberal, on the other hand, is someone who wants the same basic improvements in society, but wants to use the federal government to pass laws that force private industry or the states to pay for everything. At least that's the way I've been able to determine the difference between the two. For example, the current Progressive Democratic Party wants universal, single-payer health care for everyone in the United States, paid for and administered by the federal government. Liberal Democrats in the past wanted the government to regulate private health insurance to its standard and obligate everyone to acquire insurance, but the costs would be shared among the federal government, the state governments, and private citizens. The now famous Obamacare program from the administration of that name tried that approach, and the result was less than spectacular. The program now, in effect, is very restrictive. It's expensive, and most of the expense falls on the shoulders of middle-class citizens who have to pay their part. The fourth system began after the Republicans blamed the Democrats for the economic panic of 1893. The Panic of 1893 was a very serious economic crisis in the country that impacted all aspects of the U.S. economy until 1897, something like the Great Depression, but on a smaller scale and without all of the international consequences. But it did produce a great deal of political upheaval and realignment in the political parties in the United States. The central domestic issues at the time became government regulation of railroads, which had become very powerful both economically and politically because they made billions of dollars because they didn't have to buy the land they built on, and they got all kinds of government subsidies. They also saw the development of large corporations or trusts that became monopolies and controlled prices and controlled products. They wanted protective tariffs on imported goods, which we've seen before. There was also the new question of the role of labor unions, which were just beginning to come into vogue in the country. Child labor was a constant problem in the United States at that time, and corruption in party politics by what they call party machines was rampant, especially in large cities like New York and Chicago. It also became a question for the selection or election of senators. Originally under the Constitution, senators in the United States were appointed by each state. At this time, people decided that it would be better if, instead of being appointed, they were actually elected by the voters of each state. Racial segregation was becoming a problem. There were many African-American freed slaves around, and they were still being treated as semi-slaves and not given the privileges of normal U.S. citizens. And there was also began to be a call for the control of immigration. Many of these topics are still high on the list of debates today, by the way, and the Democrats are preaching on those two topics, immigration and segregation, constantly. Most of the voting blocks in this period continued essentially unchanged, but some realignment took place, giving Republicans dominance in the industrial Northeast and some new strength in the border states. Historians have long debated why no Labor Party ever emerged in the United States, in contrast to Europe, for example. There was, in fact, an attempt to form a Labor Party, actually a labor-farmer coalition after World War I, but they could never come to agreement, the farmers and the labor unions, and it never came to pass. The fifth party system emerged from the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, in 1932, replacing the Republican Herbert Hoover. Hoover had the misfortune to be president when the stock market collapsed in 1929, leading to the Great Depression. The Republicans rapidly began losing support after the beginning of the Great Depression, allowing President Roosevelt to begin to put into place his activist New Deal. The Democrats promoted American liberalism based on a coalition of voting blocks of specific groups especially ethnic and religious constituents like Catholics, Jews, African Americans, white Southerners, well-organized labor unions, urban political machines, progressive intellectuals, and populist farm groups. With that backing, they almost couldn't lose. The Roosevelt Democratic era lasted through the Depression and into the World War II. Due to his great popularity arising from his actions during the Depression and his resolve after the beginning of World War II, Roosevelt became the only US president ever elected for more than 2 terms of office. He was, in fact, elected 4 times. He died during his 4th term. But as a result of his 4 elected terms, the Congress passed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, limiting a president to serving no more than 2 elected terms of office. The reason for that amendment was that was felt that unlimited election of the same man to the presidency might lead to the development of a monarchy-like line of succession. It was a good idea. As we can see from so many of the re-elections of populist governments in Latin America and other places around the world that have become disasters. During this period, the opposition Republicans were divided between a very conservative wing and a somewhat more flexible moderate wing. However, the moderates steadily lost influence inside the party, and the Republicans became definitely the party of the right, or the conservative party, leaving the Democrats with free use of the liberal tag. The 6th party system, in which exists at the current time, came in and is what we have now. New voter coalitions emerged gradually after the latter half of the 20th century, after Republican Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968. Conservative Southern Democrats, sometimes called Dixiecrats because the use of Dixie was a nickname for the old Confederate South states. And normal Republicans began to work with the Dixiecrats so that they became the dominant voting bloc in the South. In many rural areas of the Midwest, and even in the more affluent suburbs, were people who were comfortable with their lives and didn't want liberal ideas coming in to complicate things for them. Liberals and the Democrats increasingly started to rely on coalitions of African American, Hispanic, and some white urban progressives in the Northeast and coastal areas, especially the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington, as their voter base. And that's the situation that exists in the US politics today. The Northeast, the West Coast, and most large cities with large African American and Hispanic populations vote Democratic. And rural areas and smaller cities tend to vote Republican. In the US, news and information media today, it is popular to illustrate possibly complex information and ideas on a TV screen or in a newspaper using maps and graphs and using colors to highlight different information. In the 2000 election between Democrat Al Gore and Republican George Bush, someone, probably from CNN, came up with the idea of using the colors red and blue to highlight states that voted or tended to vote for the different parties. If you looked at a map of the United States today, with each state colored according to the way it voted in 2016, it is likely to vote next Tuesday. Red for Republican and blue for Democrat. If you look at that map, you will see that almost all of the central and southern part of the country are red, while all of the West Coast and all of the Northeast are blue. There are a few states scattered around that are referred to as battleground states that are so evenly divided that it is almost impossible to predict which way they will vote in the election. In those maps, the states may be colored purple, a mix of red and blue, or they may be gray, And the gray is used to avoid confusion for partially colorblind people like me, where purple and red and blue are not all that different. Another complication for people who like to predict election outcomes, is that only about 60% of US voters are registered as members of one of the two main political parties. According to the most recent information, 31% of the voters are registered as Democrats, 29% are Republicans, and 38%, like me, are declared as independents. Actually, if the actual voters, and remember that in the United States, voting is not obligatory. If the actual voters show up in those proportions, winning or losing will depend on which way the independent vote goes. And that is what can make US elections so potentially interesting and difficult to predict, as we saw in 2016, in which all predictions were that Democrat Hillary Clinton would handily defeat Republican upstart Donald Trump by a large margin. Yet Trump won the electoral college by a very wide margin, even though Clinton won the popular vote by several million votes. I started to try to explain the electoral college, but I decided that might get a little bit complicated and time consuming. So just take my word for it. Of course, the fact that Clinton won the popular vote infuriated the Democratic liberals and progressives, and they went into basically a hysterical political depression that is still in place. In my opinion, the violent and totally irrational and totally deceitful Democratic campaign against all things Trump has destroyed all resemblance of the last few years in politics in the United States. And there I go getting political again. For completeness, and I am coming to the end, I should say that there have been and still are minor parties on the US political scene, but they have been and still are relatively insignificant in terms of their political effect. There are three that have hung on for a while, and they include what is called the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and the Constitution Party. For a few years in the 20th century, the Communist Party and Socialist parties routinely offered up presidential candidates, but they never won any votes, and as far as I know, are pretty much non-existent today. The Libertarian Party was founded in 1971. It is the largest continuing third party in the United States, with something over 500,000 registered voters across the 50 states. As of 2019, they have about 176 minor elected officials throughout the country. And in 2016 presidential election, the Libertarian candidate received just over 4 million votes, or 3.3% of the popular vote, which is significant and could have had an effect on the election. The Libertarian Party's core aims are to reduce the size, influence, and expenditures at all levels of government, but especially the federal government. To achieve that, the party supports minimally regulated markets, a less powerful federal government, a strong defense of civil liberties, a significant liberalization of drug laws, open immigration, non-interventionism and neutrality in foreign affairs, free trade and free movement of people and goods among all foreign countries, and a more directly representative republic. As of 2016, it is the third largest political party in the United States. The Green Party, as you might expect, is an ecological party, has been active as a third party since the 1980s. The first party gained widespread public attention during Ralph Nader's second presidential run in 2000, and is thought to have won enough potential Democratic votes to give the victory to Republican George Bush over Democrat Al Gore. Currently, the primary national Green Party organization in the US is the Green Party of the United States, which has taken in the earlier Green Party and Green Party USA. The Green Party in the United States has won elected office only at the local level. Most winners of public office in the United States who are considered Greens have won using non-partisan ballot elections. That is, elections in which the candidate's party affiliations was not printed on the ballot. The Green Party generally holds a left-wing ideology on most important issues. Greens obviously emphasize environmentalism, more open and easy access in participatory democracy, social justice, respect for diversity, peace, and nonviolence, all of which pretty much everybody goes for that. As of 2016, it is the fourth largest organized political party in the United States. The Constitution Party is a very small national conservative political party that was founded as the U.S. Taxpayers Party in 1992. It was changed to the Constitution Party in 1999. The Constitution Party is very strongly pro-life, that is anti-abortion, supports gun rights, and supports restrictions on immigration. It calls for protectionist trade policies, and while the party is mostly active in local elections, it has presented candidates in presidential elections, but they never amount to anything. The most successful third-party presidential campaign in U.S. history was that of Ross Perot in 1992. Although his bid as an independent candidate for president was unsuccessful, it was considered a game changer in U.S. politics at the time. Perot was a Texas industrialist, a billionaire who made his money in high-tech industry at the time. He had never served as a public official, but he had great experience working at the head of several successful corporations and had been involved in public affairs for the previous 3 decades. Grassroots organizations are informal groups who worked on their own time to help out, sprang up in every state to help get Perot on the ballots in the individual states. Perot focused his campaign on his plans to balance the federal budget, further economic nationalism, that is protectionism, strengthen the war on drugs, and implement electronic town halls throughout the nation for direct democracy. His expertise, by the way, was in high-tech electronic and computer materials. His views were variously described as a combination of East Texas populism with high-tech wizardry. Supporters saw him as a non-political and witty folk hero, and critics described him as authoritarian, which is true, and short-tempered, which is also true. Perot largely financed his own campaign and relied on marketing and grassroots support. In certain polls, he actually led the three-way race with Republican Bush and incumbent President Bush and Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas, the Democratic candidate. Perot appeared on every state ballot as a result of the earlier draft efforts. He won several counties, finished second in place in 2 states, and finished in 3rd place overall. He received close to 19% of the popular vote. The only third-party candidate to make such an impact, the only other third-party candidate to make a comparable impact was Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. It's probably true in this case that Perot's 19% came mostly from voters who would normally have voted for Bush, thereby giving the election to Bill Clinton. And this is final anecdote. I thought it might be interesting because some people ask me, why do the Democratic and Republican parties use animals as their logos? The donkey is for the Democrats and the elephant is for the Republicans. The Democratic donkey arose when Andrew Jackson was running for president in 1830 for the new Democratic Party. Opponents of Jackson often referred to him as a jackass, which is just another more insulting word for the term for the donkey. Instead of being insulted, which was their intention, however, Jackson thought it was funny and started using the image of the donkey on his campaign material. It has stayed with the Democrats to this day. The story of the Republican elephant is a little less clear-cut. During the Civil War, the phrase "seeing the elephant" became something of an inside joke among soldiers when they talked about being in combat. The symbol didn't immediately catch on with the Republican Party, but in the 1870s, a political cartoonist began to use the image in his cartoons to represent Republicans, who had, of course, been the abolitionist party and in a way had brought on the Civil War. The cartoonist's intentions was not initially meant to be flattering, evidently, but it caught on, and the elephant eventually became the standard symbol of the Republican Party. So that pretty much sums up, to the best of my ability, my brief history and summary of the evolution of political parties in the United States. The election 5 days from now are and will be for the foreseeable future, possibly a crucial turning point for the parties and for the United States. The current political chaos in the US for this election is extraordinary and is very, very negative. It is, in effect, a massive attempt by Democrats to take advantage of a campaign of personal hatred against Donald Trump, plus a massive media manipulated smear campaign against him. And here I'm getting very partisan, including massive amounts of demonstrable lies and deceptions on the part of the mainstream press, many government officials, and even those Republicans who really, really hate the guy. They attack his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, his campaign's alleged collusion with Russia during the 2016 campaign, his administration's alleged mistreatment of illegal aliens coming across the border from Mexico, his personal racism, his alleged support for white supremacist groups, and various other questions. The stated aim of the Progressive Democratic Party, and this is what they have said publicly, is to completely change the basic nature of the politics, social fabric, and economic structure of the United States. To put it in their own words, never fail to take advantage of a crisis to obtain your political goals. This is their quote. And they have enlisted the aid of violent socialist and communist organizations such as the Black Lives Matter and Antifa to try to force their goals on the country. They have even threatened publicly to burn down the system if Trump wins re-election. These are dangerous times for the United States and ultimately, I would say, the entire world. I probably will not sleep well for the next few nights, or perhaps even longer. On a slightly, hopefully brighter note, I hope you've been able to understand most of what I've said and perhaps take away some useful or at least interesting information from it. I have tried, not successfully totally, to stay away from too many specific controversies between the two parties during this election, because there are so many to discuss and try to explain that it would be impossible to do in a short time. If it comes up in a specific question, I'll try to answer it. Again, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank everyone involved for inviting me to speak today. I will be happy to try to answer any questions you have in the remaining time. And oh yes, I don't want to forget, if anyone didn't understand anything about what I said, I can offer for a small fee a fairly complete transcript of the talk. I am, of course, joking about the small fee, but I am serious about the transcript. If you want to know basically what I said, I can send a link and you can read it. Thank you, and I hope, as I said, you got something out of it. Now I need a drink of water.
Eugenio?
Yes, hi, my name is Eugenio. I'm from 6 years, and I want to ask you about what are the most important aspects that Argentina should change And also, what is your opinion about our national thoughts and our patriotism?
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, it's a question that I could answer with a lot of time. As Jose said during the introduction, I've spent a lot of time in the past writing down my opinions and observations about Argentina, but they've never been published. I translated some of them to a friend here into Spanish and let him read it, and he said, "Don't translate it, don't publish it, because everybody will be angry at you." It wasn't that bad, but that was his opinion. But to answer your question, my first thought is, and this again is my way of looking at it, is that Argentinians need to get serious about their country and get serious about their government. Argentina, there's a tango, I think it was Discepolo who wrote the tango, or he made the statement, in which he said that Argentina is a country where the people like to go around in circles, or to go out and go around the block, something along that way, which to me indicated that Argentinians, in his opinion, didn't really take government and the country seriously. And I'm somewhat inclined to agree with that from what I have seen. Remember, I've been here for 35 years. I've raised children here. I've worked here. I've brought technology here. I pay my taxes, and I've suffered financially significantly from the ups and downs of different governments over those 35 years. So it's not like I'm not someone who has invested my time in the country. So first off, Argentinians have to get serious about getting their country in order. I've always said that Argentina should be one of the 5 or 10 wealthiest, most powerful countries in the world, based upon its geography, its natural resources, everything it has going for it. The intellectual quality of the people. Argentina has and produces excellent people, engineers, scientists, politicians, philosophers, and yet most of those people end up living and working somewhere else. There's no process, or there's no system in the United States for employing these intelligent people in the country, and you need those intelligent people in the country. I also sort of worked out a list in my mind of what I consider to be, what appear to be, the priorities of life for many Argentinians. Not all, not most, but the ones that I see. It seems that the first priority of most Argentinians, and it's the priority for most people in the world probably, is me, yo, and mine, nuestro, or míos, which is, as I said, that's probably pretty normal. The second priority that I notice is one of two things: either the political party or the football club. And the third is the reverse, either the football club or the political party. The fourth, I see quite often, appears to be, where am I going to go on this year's vacation? And finally, somewhere down the line, becomes a priority, becomes Argentina. I'm sorry if you find these insulting or anything, but you asked the question, and this is the way I see it as a one man's opinion. I remember that seeing pictures of Argentinians during the Guerra de las Malvinas. I hadn't moved down here yet, but I watched it very closely, with people jumping up in the streets, doing all sorts of things patriotically, giving away their jewels, giving away their fur coats and all of this sort of stuff to pay for the war, when in fact it seemed to be an act, because once the cameras were off, they all disappeared and went back basically to their lives. And the jewels, and as I understand it, the jewels and coats that they donated to pay for the war sort of disappeared into Never Never Land. So that's sort of my answer to your question. I apologize if that seems a little harsh, but sometimes I look at it like as tough love, because I really came to love Argentina. The country is a beautiful country. The people, for the most part, are fantastic people. It's just you don't seem to be able to find the right people to run the country. Okay.
Bueno, muy bien. Hasta acá entonces vamos redondeando porque, bueno, el tiempo ya se nos va acabando. Queremos agradecerle a Drew Meyers este momento que ha compartido con nosotros y sobre todo todo su conocimiento acerca de lo que ha sido el desarrollo de la democracia, de los partidos políticos en Estados Unidos y esta última comparación que nos ha hecho con Argentina. Así que agradecido el Instituto Marcelino Champagnat por este momento que nos ha brindado. Y bueno, seguramente estaremos en contacto para que cuando arranque la vida presencial podamos hacer algo, ya que está aquí en Río Tercero, podamos hacer algún otro encuentrito con nuestros estudiantes para seguir compartiendo. Así que bueno, agradecemos a todos los que nos han acompañado. Les deseamos a todos que tengan un hermoso fin de semana. Y bueno, y a descansar. Muchas gracias por todo.